Today we're talking about Shaman's Ring. Shaman's Ring is one of the more complex items in Smite in regards to how exactly it functions, so we have a lot to look into here. Therefore, this will be a very in-depth video, but I will try to make very simple conclusions out of what we find in this as well. There will be a lot of numbers, but if you're primarily interested in the outcome, that will also all be explained and you will understand it at the end. First of all, a quick reminder of what Shaman's Ring offers. Shaman's Ring is a 2200 gold item. It has 60 magical power, not exactly much for this price tag. It has 10% movement speed, and dealing 100 damage to enemy guards gives you a stack. At 50 stacks, Shaman's Ring evolves, gaining a new passive that allows the wearer to deal additional 10% damage to targets hit by the wearer's abilities. What you will see here is that it's actually not true. It's not just 10% extra damage to the wearer's abilities, it's also extra damage to the basic attacks. This is important as this makes this item a lot more potent for certain guards. So, to get the full effect out of this item, you need to deal 5000 damage to enemy guards. The effect is also not quite self-explanatory, as you will mark a target by hitting them with an ability, or by affecting them with an ability. That means, for example, if you land Scylla's Crush on an enemy, but not the damage part, just the slow part, it will already proc Shaman's Ring, whereas some other abilities like Janus Slow Threshold will also proc it. Even dashing through an enemy with Tho's Dash, while not actually dealing any damage to them, just the dash itself will mark them. So there are some strange interactions that you kind of have to be aware of for this. So some guards can mark an enemy with the extra damage mark before they actually hit an ability. The general rule of thumb though is that you will hit an enemy with the first ability, they get marked, and then you will deal 10% extra damage, or if you have a dot, the dot will tick for 10% extra damage after the first hit. And as if that in itself isn't complex enough, we also need to talk about the 10% extra damage. This is not quite as simple as it may sound to some, but on the other hand, it's simpler than it may sound to some. This has nothing to do with the power that you have. If an ability has low scaling, this 10% will still give you more extra damage, as this 10% is applied to both the base damage of an ability as well as the scaling damage. As such, it doesn't really have anything to do with the power, but rather the damage that comes out at the end, which then gets this multiplier of 1.1, 10% extra. This is something we only really see on penetration otherwise, where when you have a penetration item, it will not only amplify the base damage of an ability, but also the scaling as more of your actual damage goes through. The nice benefit of percentage extra damage is that we don't have to test it on a target with a certain number of protections. We can just use the raw damage values and increase those, whereas with penetration we always have to calculate against the enemy's protection, so the damage varies from enemy to enemy. For example, a mage, a squishy mage versus a guardian will obviously have different protections. Got all that? To sum that up, you get extra power, extra movement speed, and if you get 5000 damage to enemy guards, then you will get 10% against them extra after the first hit of an ability or the first tick or proc or whatever. We'll talk about the utility towards the end. Let's first of all talk about the damage in itself, because that's what you're mainly buying this item for. Shaman's Ring has 60 power, which is for its price relatively low. If you compare that to other items around the price range, not exactly the same price, but around the same price range that are also built primarily for power and then additionally for other effects, we have Bancroft's Talon with 100 power, Book of the Dead with 100 power, Book of Thoth with 136 power on a level 20 guard, which ramps up to 158 when it's fully stacked, and we have Soul Reaver also with 100 power. For good measure, I've included an extra column for Shaman's Ring with no passive, simply because as we don't always have the passive, it's interesting to see how much less damage we deal on that first hit. But this is just the base damage of the isolated items. In order to compare better, we also have the full power of a full build, and later on we'll also look at a half-finished build where you could consider to buy these power items. Let's first look at the full build here. As you can see, most of these will have 760 power, the only difference being Shaman's Ring with 699. I've assumed that in every single build you will have Pan Boots, you will have Obsidian Shard, you will have Rod of Tahuti, because those items are pretty much core for any burst guard, any damaging guards that are looking for that kind of build style. Then on top of that, I've always added at least one 100 power item, which could be Bancroft's Book of the Dead, Soul Reaver, doesn't really matter, and Book of Thoth because it has the highest isolated power with 158 over the others, meaning that it will give you most when it's fully stacked. So if you're looking for a high power damaging build, you want to include Book of Thoth. Then the last item was either another 100 power item, the one we were looking at here, or it was Shaman's Ring, which simply has a little less power. If you're wondering about that 699, it's because Book of Thoth has an 0.5 power on top. So even though in an ideal build you may sacrifice some of that power for more utility, we're looking at the highest power values here to see how we can really maximize Shaman's Ring compared to the others. Now let's bring in some abilities. First of all, let's assume an ability that has very high base damage, 1000 maybe, and 0% scaling. That would mean Shaman's Ring wins, because it gets an extra 10%, 100 damage, it would deal 1100 damage. Every other item would just make it deal 1000 damage. Those abilities don't really exist. The next condition is the exact opposite, which also doesn't exist, but tells us a little more. If you look at the scaling of just the item itself here, with all extra factors considered, then Shaman's Ring will only have 66 damage. Bancroft's Talon, Book of the Dead, and Soul Reaver all have 100 damage, and Book of Thoth, assuming fully stacked as well, will have 158.5 damage. So Book of Thoth would come out on top. But if we're now looking at the full build with all items included, then it looks better for Shaman's Ring. Shaman's Ring actually comes out at 768.9, whereas the others all have 760. The problem here is, if we look at Shaman's Ring with no passive, it only has 699, obviously, as it only has 699 power. So in that regard, it's kind of unfavorable for Shaman's Ring. So if an ability has a lot of scaling, then usually other options are a little better. But let's look at this a little further, because now we put the two together and actually use damage values that we have in the game. The first one being Ra's Ultimate. Ra's Ultimate has 700 base damage at max rank and 100% scaling, so scaling of 1. As such, if we take our power values here and combine them with the base values, the highest value actually ends up being on Shaman's Ring. It's 1539. The others all come in at the same, because they obviously have the same power here, 1460. At the same time, Shaman's Ring with no passive comes in lowest once again with 1399. So you gain some damage on the second hit, but you lose some damage on the first hit. So this depends a little bit on if the target's already marked, or if you're gonna hit someone with the ult before something else. Depending on that, the damage will be higher or lower. And we see the same thing here if we look at Ra's 1. Ra's 1 has lower base damage, obviously. Maxed out, it has 335 base damage, and it has an 0.8 or 80% scaling. With Shaman's Ring, you deal 983 damage. With the others, you deal 943 damage. With Shaman's Ring with no passive, you deal 894 damage. What you can generally very approximately see here is this. The initial hit of Shaman's Ring, when you don't have the passive yet, will usually deal fairly less than the other items do, but then the hit after that will deal a fair amount more, and they kind of even each other out. So if you hit an enemy with two abilities, you'll roughly deal the same damage under ideal conditions. So the damage between Shaman's Ring or the other items would be the same. More abilities would be in favor of Shaman's Ring. Now let's look at the same abilities and items under other conditions. Specifically, having a starter like Vamp Shroud, Pen Boots, and then the item from above. Depending on the item, the power will look a little bit different here. Shaman's Ring now has 125 power, most of the others have 165 power, and Book of Thoth, this time not included in the other builds, will have 195 power. As such, the damage values also look different. Ra's 1 will now deal 478 damage with Shaman's Ring, it will deal 500 with most of the other items, and it will deal 530 with Book of Thoth. Even less if you consider that Shaman's Ring on its first hit will deal less damage, where it's only 435. This is almost a 100 damage difference between the two, and this is including the fact that Book of Thoth is not even stacked, whereas in Shaman's Ring's case we have assumed the favor that it's stacked so we can activate the passive after the first hit. With Ra ult, numbers look a little bit different again. Shaman's Ring comes out over most of the others here with 660 damage when being hit after getting the passive on. The others have 640, and only Book of Thoth has more with 670, which could be even more if it was fully stacked. And for our last test, we use the same item build and look at Shonqui's 1, which is a ticking dot. In this case, we can assume that the only hit not affected by Shaman's Ring with the very first tick of it, so the calculation is a little bit different and we don't need the last column where we're talking about Shaman's Ring with no passive. Instead, we all include that in Shaman's Ring's calculation. You can see it down there. It looks a little complex if you want to look at the exact numbers and how exactly this is put together. So, in this case, Shaman's Ring will deal a total of 425 damage, the first hit dealing less and the other ones dealing more. The other items deal 423 damage, and then Book of SLOTH deals 446 damage. Now, we have all these numbers, we have all these calculations, but we haven't talked about the elephant in the room. What is the rest of the effects on these items? Because almost none of these items are just bought for the pure power, maybe with the exception of Book of SLOTH, which already has more power than the others. If we're looking at Bancroft's Talon, you get extra lifesteal, you get extra up to 100 power. And this 100 power will mean that in the end you will deal 100 extra damage, putting it completely even with Shaman's Ring in pretty much any department, assuming that the passive is stacked. If you're looking at Book of the Dead, we get a 200 HP extra and up to 400 HP shield roughly on a squishy, so an extra 600 HP in some situations along with the lifesteal. If we're looking at Soul Reaver, you get an ability that deals an extra 10% true damage, which will often outclass the Shaman's Ring damage simply because it goes off the enemy's health. Not necessarily always, but this can work. And then on Shaman's Ring, we have movement speed. So they all have their own benefits, but considering that this all was already kind of in Shaman's Ring favor, the benefits of Shaman's Ring overall are a bit questionable to me. While I don't think that stat-wise Shaman's Ring is a bad item, it kind of falls in the same category as the others here and it's a little bit cheaper than most of them, but only a little bit. It does have this passive which you have to stack first. Yes, you have to stack Book of SLOTH as well, but Book of SLOTH comes with a lot more power right off the box, and the benefit from stacking it fully isn't actually that high later in the game. With Shaman's Ring, without these stacks, this item is pretty much nothing. It's much weaker than the others. So you have to have the full stacks, and dealing 5000 damage when you already deal less damage than the others, because you have the weaker item, is kinda taking a while. It can be done, but it's not something that you would just immediately do. Even in late game, it requires chunking down a few tanks on your own or having some sort of way of applying a lot of damage to multiple people at once in order to get the stacks quickly. So this is something that's very important when it comes to this item. You will actually see in the footage in the background that I buy the item, but actually don't even get the full stacks because with our Kwang, you're much more single target focused and 5000 damage really takes a while to get because usually you just kill an enemy. And that also excludes the fact that I have excluded specific items that make it more complex. Polynomicon, for example, with this extra damage through the basic attack, could easily deal more extra damage than Shaman's Ring when played right. Shaman's Ring, opposed to many other effects, is also purely single target, and other effects which can just work against the whole team. We've also left out one of the big elephants in the room, Spear of Desolation. Spear of Desolation doesn't have quite as much power, so it wouldn't work as well here, but as it has penetration, in an actual in-game scenario, the extra damage may be much higher. Can't reapply that here because otherwise I would have gone through even more numbers for all the different targets. The item was originally compared to Sunder, but the difference between it and Sunder is that Sunder does not take up an item slot, and that's the big benefit of it, because you can still build as much power as you want to, or even have a teammate build Sunder for you. So that kind of voids the percentage part of it a little bit. While being more dependent on external factors through crowd control having to be applied to the enemy, Runeforged Hammer is very similar to this, and even that comes with the extra damage right off the box. Gem of Isolation is another item to keep in mind if we're looking at this item. While it doesn't give you movement speed, it slows the enemies and gives you a lot more survivability and utility, which also should in many situations make it just somewhat superior to Shaman's Ring, even though it doesn't bring the same damage in immediately. The interesting part, however, is that it actually amplifies basic attacks, and that's where I see the potential for this item. Even though it's not stated in the description, it does work, for example, for Kronos, it does work for Freya, Ao Kuang, Sol, and this is where I think it has its way to somehow be applied. The problem in question is, when do you build it? Build it too early and you lose most of your power spike for the early game, build it too late and you will have a hard time even getting the stacks up. My thought here is that the best place to build this item is if you already have another movement speed item, for example through Hasten the Ring, through Demonic Grip, or even both, and then replace your boots with this in late game. Problem, again, you have to get the stacks, but if the game really goes that long, then this will always give you more damage than any sort of boots could. But again, I think there are places for basic attack mages where this can be reasoned for even earlier than that, depending on how you want to plan your build out. I wouldn't necessarily always replace my, for example, Bancroft's Talon with it though, because I think that's a very potent item. Or if you're building Poly, then you should probably stick to Poly in most situations and only really get Shaman's Ring when you definitely need that movement speed and you're definitely able to get those stacks up relatively quickly, which is only happening in very few situations, in my opinion. So, in conclusion, Shaman's Ring has a very long ramping up time until it becomes effective, and when it's effective, it's usually not much more effective than similar items that have similar effects. The benefits come out of the fact that it gives you extra movement speed, which is better and worse than some other benefits that you can have depending on the situation, depending on your playstyle, and that it will become very effective if you land a lot of basic attacks on the target after you attack them with one ability. With that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this was insightful and informative. If you're not subscribed yet, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell. It really helps me out. See you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.